Okay. Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the team Calcutta Comparatists 1919, I take this privilege to warmly welcome you to the 39th lecture of our lecture series. Calcutta Comparatists 1919 is an independent forum for the research scholar of humanities and social sciences. It carries the legacy of the academic study of Indian languages and literature and the idea of literary comparison, which was envisioned by Sir Ashutosh Mukherjee and introduced in 1919 at the University of Calcutta. Calcutta Comparative 1919 took inspiration and ideas from this history, and it was created initially for sharing research interest and ideas across the scholars abroad and in India. We are organizing online lectures on various interdisciplinary topics to be delivered by academicians and distinguished scholars of different fields. We warmly welcome you all to today's lecture. Thank you for joining us today. Now I would like to request our host Arif to take over the mic and introduce our speaker of the day. Over to you, Arif. Start.
Good evening, everybody. Today we have Dr. Somjyoti Mridha, who teaches at the Department of English, Northeastern Hill University at Shillong, Meghalaya. He completed his doctoral research on representation of Kashmir conflict post 1990s from the Center for English Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. His areas of interest are post-colonial studies, ideas of nation and nationalism, and also Indian English literature. So I would like to say, Dr. Somjyoti Mridha, if you would start the lecture, please.
Okay, thank you, Arif. And at the outset, I would like to thank Calcutta Comparatists 1919 for, for giving me the platform. And I would certainly like to thank Pro Team for, nicely writing to me and, of course, for the opportunity once again. So without further delay, I would like to sort of begin with the talk. And so as I have titled it, Writing Nation, Writing Resistance, Anglophone Kashmiri literature post-1990s. So this is basically, we are, all of us living in India are sort of, more or less aware of the situation in Kashmir. We have grown up with that. So its literary productions from there are somewhat, different from other parts of India. And basically, the discussion that we're going to have, the lecture will be primarily take a look into the literary productions which has happened post-conflict. So, we have all read news items about Kashmir recently, also and also previously. And the thing about Kashmir is that it is always shrouded in various discourses, discourses of nationalism, regionalism, violence, all kinds of conflict-ridden ideologies, a little bit of religious fundamentalism, everything. So to understand Kashmir, we have to sort of look beyond these discourses. So some of the commonsensical discourses under the influence of which we all live regarding Kashmir are something like, some of these discourses are generated by popular mainstream culture, like Bollywood. For instance, there's a very famous saying, in one of the movies, I believe it's Ma Tujhe Salam, where Sunny Deol says something very dramatic dialogue that "Doodh mango to kheer denge, Kashmir mango to cheer denge." This kind of hyper nationalist assertions over the topography over the land of Kashmir, and there are many such, occasionally given by our politicians, our opinion shapers and other people. And also, there are counter discourses to that, which are generated in Kashmir. For instance, there are discourses which you will find among the secessionists or Kashmiri nationalists, who would say that Kashmir is older than India. primarily harping on the fact that the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir was, formed in 1846 by the Treaty of Amritsar between Raja Gulab Singh and the British East India Company. So so saying that Kashmir existed a priori the nation state and things like that. The nation state of India, further, and also Pakistan for that matter. So there are various such discourses, and Anglophone Kashmiri literature or other Kashmiri literature, primarily in Urdu and Kusher, are somewhat bursts the myth around these discourses. They generally tend to sort of negate this kind of discourses that are generated in popular domain in mainstream media and culture, etc. So and of course, these discourses, what they generally do is negate history, negate any kind of understanding of subcontinental history and contingent political circumstances, because of which, let's say, a princely state like Jammu and Kashmir came into being after the First Anglo-Sikh War. And of course, the nation states of India and Pakistan came into being in 1947. Due to the partition of the subcontinent, etc., etc., all of which has its bearings in the Kashmir conflict, so to speak, which we sort of know a little bit about, all of us. Now, in order to understand what is behind the conflict, it is better to sort of take a brief foray into history. So, as I have already mentioned, that Kashmir was formed by the Treaty of Amritsar between Raja Gulab Singh and the British East India Company, and by which the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir came into being, and it became part of the British Indian Empire as a with the subsidiary alliance, as a subsidiary alliance to the British colonizers. And of course, the Dogra dynasty began its rule with the treaty, and Kashmir, which was part of the erstwhile Sikh Empire, now became a princely state with its own feudal with its own king, and but not a sovereign king, but under the suzerainty of the British empire, under the suzerainty of the British Raj. And with that, we find that someone who is sort of alien to Kashmiri land and soil became the ruler, and thereby generated a sense of alienation among Kashmiri populace from the mid 19th century. There is another crucial factor which will throw a bit of light, is that while the indigenous Kashmiri Pandits, who were demographically minuscule, were inducted into the Dogra bureaucracy, the Kashmiri Muslims, who are primarily peasants and artisans, were not properly inducted into the administration. They were oppressed. There was heavy taxation, and one of the major problem was the ban on cow slaughter, which led to religious hostility and etc. in Kashmir during from the mid 19th century, which led to a certain kind of antipathy towards the Dogra monarchy. So it is also noteworthy that as along with the Indian struggle for freedom against the British, which began more or less from by the 1890s, more or less, simultaneously there was also a Kashmiri struggle for independence from the Dogra monarchy, and that begins sort of the real struggle begins sort of from 1931. And most Kashmiri militants and Kashmiri nationalist ideologues draw their lineage from the events of 1931, which was the first recorded, resistance against Dogra monarchy. So this anti-Dogra feeling erupted in 1931, and very interestingly, Indian nationalists supported Kashmiri nationalists, and thereby we hear about the friendship of Jawaharlal Nehru and Sheikh Abdullah, who was the leader, mass leader of Kashmiri nationalist movement, Kashmiri nationalist movement, and against the Dogras, the Dogra regime. So, and of course, this in the process of this anti-Dogra resistance, there also grows a certain degree of hostility towards the Kashmiri Pandits, because the Kashmiri Pandits became the face of the Dogra bureaucracy in Kashmir, thereby making them as the enemy closer home. So a certain level of religious polarization has been happening under the aegis of Dogra monarchy since the mid 19th century. And of course, I mean, that has its own bearing in the context of the armed conflict and the subsequent exodus of the Pandits, which I will deal a little later. So, and then with the departure of the British in 1947 from the subcontinent, the state of Jammu and Kashmir was sort of ambiguously incorporated into the Union of India through an instrument of accession, which the then King Hari Singh signed under duress, because, as you know, that there was a northwest frontier tribal invasion, which is popularly known as Kabali invasion of 1948. And the Maharaja wanted to, in order to save his capital, sought Indian military assistance, which was provided on condition that he joins the Indian nation state. And that's where the problem begins, because the instrument of accession and the Indian government agreed in the UN and also in public forums in the valley, in Kashmir Valley, that there will be a referendum. There will be but that was never conducted, and that has remained the primary bone of contention and one of the major demands of Kashmiri nationalists or secessionists, because they primarily claim their separate nationhood on the basis of this, that you know uh, uh, the plebiscite which was promised was never you know uh, was never conducted. But that is what they are saying. But there are other sides of the story, because the plebiscite was supposed to happen after the withdrawal of forces by both the nation states, and Pakistan was asked to do it first, but that never happened, and hence India never withdrew its forces, and the plebiscite could never be conducted. And primarily, also remember that it is because of this that Kashmir has become the most militarized zone in the world. It's the deployment of army, and I'm talking about prior to the declaration of Union Territory status for the state of Jammu and Kashmir. Per six civilian, there was one army personnel stationed in the valley. So you can imagine the extent of militarization in the valley. So so this is the historical context, and of course, as you know, that in the late 1980s, there were allegations of rigging and corruption against the Farooq Abdullah government, and a few youths, Kashmiri youths, formed a new political party called Muslim United Front, and they contested elections. While they won only 4 seats, but it was alleged that Congress and National Conference, that is Farooq Abdullah's party, sort of rigged the elections. It's of course all these are in the allegation as allegations that they rigged the elections and thereby they lost. And it is interesting that two of the prominent leaders of Muslim United Front, that is Yasin Malik and Yusuf Shah, and they went on to form the two most deadly militant organizations of the 1990s, that is Jammu and Kashmir Liberation Front, JKLF by Yasin Malik, and Hizbul Mujahideen by Yusuf Shah. And of course, we know that there was a massive armed conflict in parts of the valley, and the valley normal life, of course, came to a standstill by let's say till about the mid 1995, till at least for 5-6 years. There's absolutely no normal life in Kashmir, and life almost came to a standstill. Now it is in this context, it is this historical event, it is this socio-political development that led to the subsequent efflorescence of Anglophone Kashmiri literature, which talks about the Kashmir conflict. Now, when I say post 1990s, what I mean is that Anglophone Kashmiri literature, which sort of talks about this conflict, this armed resistance against the Indian state. And of course, it is self-evident that this Anglophone literature will talk about resistance, will talk about the aspirations of the Kashmiri populace, which is, of course, simultaneously politically against the narratives or the policies of the Indian government, which is something that we have to understand, that the the political ambitions of the Kashmiri people has somewhat become contrary to the political narratives and the political agenda of the Indian nation state, and this bifurcation it still continues. And as we know that the current regime has gone on to declare, or rather demote, the state of Jammu and Kashmir into a union territory, bifurcating it between Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh. So Ladakh, which was part of the erstwhile state of Jammu and Kashmir, has now become a separate union territory. Well, and I've given a brief historical overview. Now, this literary efflorescence, or the Anglophone the Kashmiri literature, emerged more or less from the late 1990s. Uh, and of course, it is that there are various kinds of literature, which is also very important, that there is no one Kashmir. Because when I say Anglophone Kashmiri literature, I also mean that Kashmiri pro-Azadi literature, narratives which are ideologically in favor of Azadi, but there are also narratives which are ideologically anti-Azadi, which does not sort of show political, show support to the secessionist politics of Kashmir. These are primarily the Pandit narratives, about which I'll talk a little later. So I'll begin with the pro-Azadi, Anglophone pro-Azadi narratives. So the literary efflorescence, of course, happened more or less in 2008 with the publication of the very famous and now almost canonical memoir by Basharat Peer, which is titled Curfew Nights. And of course, after Curfew Nights, there was almost like an avalanche of Anglophone Kashmiri narratives, primarily spearheaded by Mirza Wahid, who's the collaborator, published in 2011, and the Book of Gold Leaves, 2014. Then there was Shahnaz Bashir's novel, The Half Mother. Then another one he published is called Scattered Souls. And of course, others. All of them have, a lot of them have now published their novels and memoirs, etc., etc. And of course, in the on the and Aga Shahid Ali, who is of course the first one to write about Kashmir conflict. He has, of course, many collections of poems, but The Country Without a Post Office, published in 1997, is the first literary, product which sort of talks about the conflict. Anyway, and of course, all the authors that I have mentioned previously draws their lineage, their literary lineage, from Aga Shahid Ali. He's almost regarded as the father figure in the pro-Azadi Anglophone Kashmiri literature. But this literature is very interesting, and this is something very, very interesting, because unlike the other Anglophone Indian, the other Anglophone Indian literature, which is of course a flourishing field now, and with plethora of writers, popular narratives, serious literature, and even metro reads and things like that. We've got a very diverse forms of narratives. Diverse forms of literary productions happening in India right now, from across the length and breadth of the country, with many publishers coming in, and etc., etc. But Anglophone Kashmiri literature, provides a breath of fresh air, because most of Anglophone Indian literature is primarily about the elite, metro-based elite lifestyle. It's primarily deals with urban problems and the aspirational middle class, etc., etc. And there is a certain level of, what should I say, myopia and boredom associated with the literature. But Anglophone Kashmiri literature is totally different from it, because the mainstay of Anglophone Kashmiri literature is conflict. So it has an absolutely different kind of language. The language is totally, it's fresh, and it talks about, of course, it does talk about Srinagar, which is given a certain level of centrality, but also about rural areas of Kashmir, which where the real militant activities happen, and the armed forces are also more oppressive in the rural areas. And there is the vocabulary is so different, and in most narratives, even the writers themselves talk about the difference in Kashmiri reality and other mainstream Indian reality, because they say that, I mean, the major words, that is the most recurrent words, are something like Kalashnikov, or CRPF, BSF, JKLF, JKSLF, referring to the Student Liberation Front, and HM, Hizbul Mujahideen, and crossfire, ceasefire, language, vocabulary related to violence, something that we don't really encounter in Anglophone Indian literature. Primarily, we necessarily don't encounter this kind of vocabulary. So that is something that is very, 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 very crucial difference between Anglophone Kashmiri literature and other branches of Anglophone Indian literature. So I believe that you've got a general idea about how pro-Azadi narratives are sort of panned out in the course of this couple of decades. And since the title of the lecture is primarily about writing nation and writing resistance, now, so my lecture will be primarily based on how the Kashmiri writers are imagining the nation, because it should be kept in mind that they're primarily negating their affiliation towards the Indian nation state. So they don't consider themselves as Indian nationals. But there is, of course, a sense of ambiguity, because writers like Basharat P deals with it, that he has lived a considerable part of his life in Delhi, and he says that the kind of India that Delhi projects is so very different from the kind of India that he has encountered in Kashmir. So he is also, there is this dilemma about which India to reject and how to reject, because all of them are Indian passport holders. And people have gone on to write this in their novels, in their memoirs, that carrying an Indian passport and writing or resisting the Indian national narrative is somewhat, it's a bit ambiguous, and the ideas of nations are, there is a greater degree of ambivalence and ambiguity within their ideas of nationness. But primarily, when I'm talking about the writing the nation, I'm of course trying to sort of talk about how they write the Kashmiri nation. And as many theoreticians have explicated, like Benedict Anderson and all, that nation is an imagined community. So what I'm primarily trying to talk over here is how do they imagine the Kashmiri nation? And even scholars like Anthony D. Smith and Benedict Anderson himself has said that, have sort of explicated that how the genres of novel and literature, particularly, is so very crucial in imagining the nation. And what these narratives, and there are quite a few now, they do is to sort of conceptualize to sort of conceptualize Kashmir as a separate, distinct nation. So one of the primary ways in which they do that is by demarcating the geographical contours of the putative Kashmiri nation, because there is no separate Kashmir, so to speak, as a distinct political unit, or as a separate nation state. So what they do is they imagine the Kashmiri nation by demarcating the geographical contours of it. And this is something very, very interesting, because one of the primary ways they do that is by showing how distinct it is from other parts of India. For instance, there are most of these narratives talk about mobility, talk about movements across the Banial Tunnel to what is so called India, or what Kashmiris generally refer to as India. And they sort of demarcate the space as so very distinct, including Basharat Peer, even Anjum Jamarud Habib, about whom I did not speak previously. She has written a memoir also, Prisoner Number 100, which talks about her experiences in Tihar jail. And even Basharat Peer in her in his memoir, talks about how distinct, how different Kashmir Valley is from, let's say, Aligarh, where he was studying, and he has written at great lengths about his journey to Aligarh, the first journey, and how different train journey by train is, which is of course was not that then in his youth in Kashmir. So this is one of the ways they generate a distinctness for Kashmir by showing, by referring to the difference that exists between Kashmir Valley and other parts of India. Sometimes that also includes Jammu, which is of course part of the putative nation, Kashmiri nation again. So there is a certain kind of ambiguity and contradictions inherent in this creation, almost a superficial, not a superficial, but rather a forcible creation of difference. And not to say that there are no difference, there certainly is, and that is one way. The other way is to sort of to sort of talk about that which are the parts that are part of the Kashmiri nation. For instance, in one of her essays, Nitasha Kaul, who is one of the very unique example of a Pandit, a pro-Azadi Pandit writer, who sort of goes on to refer to the regions that are part of the putative Kashmiri nation, and she, of course, the nation that she visualizes through geographical markers is actually the border of the erstwhile Dogra state. And that has remained the hallmark of the demands by Kashmiri nationalists, that the border of the extent of the erstwhile Dogra dominion, the Dogra regime, or the Dogra monarchy remains, the Dogra state remains the geographical extent of the putative Kashmiri nation. So that is one of the ways that they sort of imagine Kashmir, that referring to geographical contours, referring to geographical borders, etc., and of course uh, showing its difference from India. Then the other way they do is by referring to cultural symbols, uh, referring to the syncretic past of Kashmir, and which is of course, and Kashmiri nationalists, they do acknowledge that there was a Hindu past, etc., like referring to the Sufi shrine of Charare Sharif. Most of the narratives, whether memoir or novels, they refer to the Charare Sharif shrine. They also refer to iconic mosques like Hazrat Bal Mosque and the other Shahi Hamdan, etc. And of course, there are references to other cultural markers. For instance, referring to Firan, then Kawa, the Kashmiri tea, then Pashmina shawls, with chinar leaves. One of them, then of course the river Jhalam, which has remained a constant reference in most of these narratives. Then reference to the syncretic cultural personalities like Lal Deed, then Nand Rishi, who is also regarded as Nuruddin, Rishi Nuruddin, and of course Habba Khatun, her poetry, Sufi poetry, etc. So some of the ways they evoke the symbols of nationality through cultural markers, through something which is beyond the concrete geographical concrete geographical contours that some writers also refer to. So that is one of the ways. Then the other way, this is another very, very pertinent, and for those of us in the subcontinent having experienced partition on both sides, etc., would find it very, very relatable, is the reference to the LOC, the line of actual control, which was sort of demarcated by the Shimla Agreement in 1972. Now, this is basically the de facto border between India and Pakistan, And it is not like what is shown in the maps produced by the Indian government. It's of course, as you know, that parts of Kashmir was sort of by is sort of Pakistan administered, or what we call as Pakistan occupied Kashmir. And a little bit of it is Aksai Chin and Saksham Valley are occupied sort of by China. So we don't really have the Indian government does not have full control of what we show as the map of Kashmir. But anyway, so the one of the very interesting ways they sort of talk about the Kashmiri nation is by referring to the line of control, the LOC, which is of course represented as an artificial border, sort of dividing uh, the Kashmirs, the two Kashmirs, in a very artificial sort of a manner. There is a this novel by Mirza Waid titled "The Collaborator" actually talks about a border village, Nogam, which where the central protagonist has to cross sort of to procure wood and also to keep a check on the infiltration of terrorists, etc., etc. So the LOC then becomes as a locus of contention, because for the Indian nation state and for the Pakistani nation state, that is the demarcation of their territorial extent. But from the Kashmiri point of view, the LOC becomes the locus of of contention, because for them both sides are Kashmir, irrespective of which nation state has taken control over it. So there is a certain kind of centrality rather accorded to the LOC. And there are other stories and other novels which talk about the LOC quite elaborately, actually. There is this very poignant story by A.G. Aether, short story. It's a short story called The Enemy, which actually talks about a brother trying to sort of cross the river Nilam, and which is also the international border, de facto international border, and trying to cross over to Pakistan to meet his brother. And then, of course, he's obstructed, and he has to sort of, he's talking about the absolute insanity of considering a river as a border and not allowing him to meet his brother who is on his deathbed, etc., etc. So the LOC becomes a very potent symbol of how the competing nationalisms and nation states of India and Pakistan has sort of, artificially divided the Kashmiri nation. The other, of course, the other features of Kashmiri narratives, or how they sort of conceptualize a nation, is by according a certain level of centrality to Srinagar, which is, of course, the putative capital of the Kashmiri nation. And we find that most of the authors have gone on to describe Srinagar at great lengths, and talking, of course, about the heavy military presence, the concertina wires that has been placed everywhere, the security checks, the checks for identity cards, and the heavy military deployment in the streets and on the public thoroughfares of Srinagar. What the authors generally stress on, especially people like Basharat Peer and Shahnaz Bashir, what they have done is they've shown how the public sphere or the public domain in Kashmir has been thoroughly militarized, and how that has vitiated the lives of normal everyday Kashmiris in their day-to-day business. How it has sort of obstructed normal life in Kashmir. So, but of course, all of this is sort of centered in Srinagar, and Srinagar is not only depicted as the locus of military domination and military presence, but also as the locus of resistance, because we do find that most of the protagonists, like for instance Faiz in the book of Gold Leaves, by the novel written by Mirza Waid, is from Srinagar, is from downtown Srinagar, and how he sort of meanders through the alleys and bylanes of Srinagar, and how he sort of conceptualizes the predicament of the common populace, and thereby decides to sort of engage in armed militancy. So in this idea that not only is Srinagar the locus of military presence, is the locus of Indian domination through military presence, it has also become the locus of resistance. in the Kashmiri imagination. Then another very, very crucial and more controversial is most of the pro-Azadi narratives, and primarily written by Kashmiri Muslim authors, but also there are some Kashmiri Pandit authors who have sort of supported the Azadi movement and have gone on to write literature and tracts in support of Kashmiri Azadi. People like Suvir Kaul, Nitasha Kaul, and Sanjay Kak has made a very, very famous documentary called Jashne Azadi. So they are in support of Kashmiri Azadi movement. But mostly the pro-Azadi narratives are written by Kashmiri Muslim authors. And what is unique and what is rather disturbing and very, very crucial for understanding the general nature of nationalism is the almost near total erasure of Pandit predicament in the context of Kashmiri nationalist movement, especially in the heyday of the militancy, the early part of the 1990s, because most of these narratives have sort of relegated the Pandit predicament, their victimization, their selective victimization, brutalization, and subsequent exodus in the 1990s as a footnote in their narratives, in their literary narratives, or in their memoirs. They are not given narrative space. It is almost like a metonymic expression of what has actually happened in the imagination of the putative Kashmiri nation. Because somehow, while there is this sense of being Kashmiri, which is different from Indian, but Kashmiri Pandits who are indigenous to Kashmiri landscape, who are, and of course they're demographically minute, somehow their exclusion is not sort of questioned, is never highlighted, and that has remained one of the major contention and one of the major flaws, rather, if one could say that, in the functioning of Kashmiri nationalism. That somehow nobody is sort of talking about it. In the among the literary narratives, and quite all of them that I have mentioned, whether Shahnaz Bashir or whether Basharat Peer, or even the documentaries by Sanjay Kak and Aga Shahid Ali, they almost sort of forget to mention this dimension of the Kashmir conflict. The only example, the only exception is Mirza Wahid's The Book of Gold Leaves, which actually devotes a lot of narrative space, a lot of thought about this grave injustice which is committed right in the neighborhood. Because Faiz, who is the central protagonist, has a Pandit neighbor, and looking at the violence in the context of the violent Srinagar of the early 1990s, the neighbors choose to migrate to Jammu. And Faiz, who is an armed militant in the novel later on, actually takes it up and sort of questions this motive among the secessionists, among the militant leaders, that this is something that is unjust. But that is the only silver lining among all the narratives, and there are quite a few now. None of them sort of thinks of devoting any narrative space, any space to the brutalization of the Pandits. So this is something very, very very, very sad. And of course, as you know, that the right-wing Indian political forces have sort of taken it up as their agenda, because we all know that Pandit resettlement into the valley has always been an election agenda among the right-wing political parties in this country, and somehow it has never been accomplished, because there is always a hue and cry in Kashmir whenever there's a talk of Pandit resettlement. And of course, a few people who have been resettled, and this has been documented in Rahul Pandita's Our Moon Has Blood Clots, that Pandits who have been resettled in settlement colonies in Kashmir did not have a very fruitful existence in the valley, and they are still they're still living there in fear, and not leading a very normal life. But that I'll come a little later. But what is very, very sad is that this issue and the predicament, the collective predicament of the Kashmiri Pandits, have become like an election agenda, with absolutely none of the governments, the subsequent governments, and it's been quite a long time now. It's been 30 years since their exodus from Kashmir Valley, nothing has really been done in order to sort of address that issue. Though every political party has sort of expressed sympathy and sort of tried to sort of explain the issue according to their own political agenda, and it is very very disheartening to see that literary narratives are sort of erasing that part of the uh, conflict. The other crucial part is the erasure of Jammu and Ladakh from the sort of imagining of, or from the, not from the imagining, because see, whenever there is a talk of the putative Kashmiri nation, that the regions of Jammu and Ladakh has always been incorporated within the geographical contours of the Kashmiri nation. But there is a near total erasure of any issues related to Jammu or Ladakh. In fact, the cultural markers that are always referred to as sort of the cultural base of Kashmiri nation, they do not include anything either from Jammu or Ladakh, but there is sort of demographic and territorial inclusion of these regions within the precincts of the putative Kashmiri nation. So while there is a erasure from the cultural arena, while there is sort of ambiguous sort of inclusion in terms of land, in terms of territory, there is near total erasure in terms of the cultural markers, in terms of their incorporation within the Kashmiri nation. So so the allegations of hegemony that Kashmiri nationalists actually allege on the Indian nation state are actually also practiced by them, because similar to their allegations that the Indian nation state is primarily a Hindu nation state and sort of marginalizing the Muslims, including the Kashmiris, which is of course the only Muslim majority uh, state in the country, but now of course it's not a state, it's a union territory. But Kashmiri nationalists also sort of functioned in similar hegemonic manner, because even within the precincts of the putative Kashmiri nation, the minorities, which of course ironically are the Hindu Kashmiri Pandits, have sort of no space within the Kashmiri putative nation, or rather don't have sort of the kind of space that they they should have been given, and they're regionally also exclusive, because Jammu and Ladakh has a very ambiguous, a very loose sort of incorporation, only in terms of their territory, not in terms of their culture, their difference from the valley, etc., etc. So while there is a power imbalance between, let's say, New Delhi, which is the sort of locus of the Indian government, the central government, and Srinagar, which is sort of the locus of the putative Kashmiri nation, there is also a power imbalance between, let's say, Srinagar and Jammu, and Srinagar and Leh or the Ladakh regions. So Kashmiri nationalism also is equally hegemonic, is similar to the Indian nationalist aspirations, etc. I hope this thing is sort of clear. So what I'm trying to say about or make a point in this lecture is that pro Azadi Anglophone Kashmiri literature, it sort of provides some kind of ideological basis, some kind of ideological or generates a certain level of ideological consensus in favor of the Kashmiri nationalist agenda, in favor of the putative Kashmiri nation, which the Kashmiri populace sort of thinks is their rightful due, is their rightful, that they should rightfully own a separate, distinct nation state, which is distinct from not only the Indian nation state but also the Pakistani nation state. And of course, they're embroiled in these competing nationalisms of India and Pakistan, and etc. etc. But this literature, this literature is sort of provides an ideological base and generates a certain kind of ideological consensus for the Kashmiri nation. But this is not all of Kashmir, and that is where I'd like to sort of now go towards the or rather look towards the Pandit narratives. Now, if we consider the pro Azadi Kashmiri Anglophone literature, is imbued with anxiety, with angst, with the sort of the aesthetics of discontent. And of course, there is a lot of discontent among Kashmiri populace regarding militarization, regarding the overhand, overbearing military presence and the way the military functions over there, presence of AFSPA, etc., etc. For the Kashmiri Pandits, their literature is imbued with the poetics of dispossession. Because the events of 1990s, which sort of is celebrated or rather glorified in the pro-Azadi narratives as events that kind of glorifies it as a resistance against this behemoth, this Indian nation state, which is militarily very powerful as compared to the Kashmiri nationalists. But for the Pandits, the same events led to their victimization, led to their brutalization and subsequent exodus to Jammu and their feeling of rootlessness. So the Pandit narratives are imbued with the poetics of dispossession. And also, it is very crucial to understand that literary response about the Kashmir conflict did not begin with pro Azadi Kashmiri narratives. It actually began with Pandit narratives, though they were not, given the kind of media coverage or the kind of, excitement with which, let's say, Basharat Peer's memoir was received by the readership. So but there are actually quite a few narratives which came prior to even Aga Shahid Ali, because Aga Shahid Ali is a country without a post office, was published in 1997. And but HK calls Firdaus in Flames, which is arguably the first literary response to Kashmir conflict, was published in 1995. HK Call, as you know, recently expired, and he was the he was the director of the India International Center at New Delhi, a very, very influential position. And he wrote Firdaus in Flames and got it published in 1995. Of course, with not so much fanfare, with not so much excitement around that time. But that is arguably the first literary response to Kashmir conflict, followed by two narratives which are in the nature of, which are ambiguously fictional as well as memoir, life writing, etc. There's a certain kind of ambiguity with genre definitions. Where two narratives, both published in 2002. One is Under the Shadows of Militancy by Tej and Dhar, and The Tiger Ladies, a memoir by Sudha Kaul, both published in 2002. Now, all the three actually predates Basharat Peer's uh, Curfew Nights, which was published in 2008. But it is also very crucial that in the memoir, Basharat Peer refers to the lack of literature surrounding Kashmir conflict. And he writes that in lonely evenings in New Delhi, where doesn't know what to do with himself, he provides, he sort of gets into the comfort of Aga Shahid Ali's poems, and that is the only succor that he derives in New Delhi. And at one point, he writes that there is a serious lack of literature about Kashmir conflict. Now, completely negating the publication of these three literary responses, which were sort of already published for quite some time during that phase. He's talking about his life in early 2000. So Firdaus in Flames was already there, and so was, let's say, Under the Shadows of Militancy and The Tiger Ladies. But he doesn't refer to them as literary response of the Kashmir conflict, which is a certain kind of, also sort of refers to the attitude that, let's say, the pro-Azadi Kashmiri authors have towards the predicament of the Pandits and their literary response. So somehow, Pandit narratives are not regarded as Kashmiri, Anglophone Kashmiri literature by the pro-Azadi group of writers. So it is of course another very, very crucial marker of, sort of exclusion, or rather crucial exclusion in the literary domain. Then, of course, the major event, of course, the watershed moment, sort of Pandit literary narratives, came with Rahul Pandita's Our Moon Has Blood Clots, which was published in 2013. And this book has actually almost become a dialectic, has formed a dialectical relationship with Basharat Peer's Curfew Nights, because even literary critics have sort of clubbed the two and discussed them in in consonance or in disjunction, in comparison with each other. So, but that is the literary response that sort of stormed the public domain in India. But even before that, Siddharth Gigu has written a novel called The Garden of Solitude in 2011, which is also regarding the Pandit predicament. And quite a few people actually, even Ashok Kekal has written a novel, not so very literary per se, but Ashok Kekal, as some of you may know or may not, is a professor of sociology, most probably in Banaras Hindu University. He has written Kashmir, My Nativity Regained, a novel, though without much fanfare. But the real change in readers' response came with Our Moon Has Blood Clots by Rahul Pandita. And Rahul Pandita's narrative is sort of exceptionally straightforward. It's almost scathing in its attack on Kashmiri nationalists. And the allegations of against Kashmiri nationalists, against the Azadi-seeking writers, as well as ideologues, as well as militants, is so scathing that occasionally it veers towards Islamophobia. And of course, one can totally understand the level of victimization, the feeling of rootlessness, the brutalization that has happened right in front of his eyes. And he has grown up with that angst. And it is so very evident in the pages that there is so much of anger which is imbued in the pages that it is impossible not to be affected by the narrative. And it's a very very straightforward narrative. And it has sort of really provided the other perspective in the Kashmir conflict, the Pandit perspective, and which it is the narrative that gained, or rather that provided the limelight to the Pandit narratives, which was rather before that. Nobody was really listening to the Pandit side of the story, because people are talking about militarization, military oppression, etc., etc. But then it is only with this narrative that it's sort of the literary world sort of became aware of the atrocities against the Pandits, which is sort of not really in the public. It was there in the public domain, but it was not really in the limelight. And that's something very very crucial, because when we talk about Kashmir, there cannot be one Kashmir. Scholars like Ashutosh Varshney, Sumantro Bose, and others have referred that there is not a single story from Kashmir. There are two stories. And Ashutosh Varshney has written that there are two stories from Kashmir, and one is from the military camps, from the army prisons, etc. But the other story is from the migrant camps in Jammu, which was mostly the Pandits who sort of had to migrate, and they've continued to live as refugees in their own land. And this is very, very crucial, because the narrative that is put forward by the pro-Azadi Kashmiri authors is so very different from what the Pandit narratives are talking about. Because what are the Pandit narratives all about? The Pandit narratives are about the victimization of the Pandits. Because the same events which are glorified as resistance against the Indian state actually led to their victimization, led to their brutalization, led to their exodus overnight from their homes and hearth, and reducing them to the status of a refugee. It is also talking about their inability to cope with Jammu, the heat of Jammu, because Jammu is more like the Indo-Gangetic plains, less like the hilly Kashmiri topography. And they are talking about the sense of permanent rootlessness, because Pandita and also Gigu repeatedly talks about how they don't feel at home in their so-called homes, which is not in Kashmir but in New Delhi, mostly New Delhi or Jammu. And there is repeated references of having lost a home, having lost their root. And also it is also very crucial that in the course of the narratives it has been repeatedly referred both by Sudha Kaul, by Siddharth Gigu, Rahul Pandita, and even Arvind Gigu, and quite a few essayists have also talked spoken about it, that the Pandit, while there was always a certain degree of discontent among Kashmiri Muslims regarding their incorporation into the Indian nation state since at least 1953, which was the first time that Sheikh Abdullah was incarcerated due to their problems, etc., etc. There was never a time when the Kashmiri Pandit population were disgruntled about the Indian nation state. In fact, they were extremely proud that the first prime minister of this country, Jawaharlal Nehru, was a Kashmiri Pandit, and their affiliation to the Indian nation state was complete. They completely identified with the Indian nation state, and well, their allegiance was completely secure with the Indian nation state. But it is only after the exodus and the apathy of the both the state government of Jammu and Kashmir and the central government, the government of India, has led them to have a sense of discontent against the Indian nation state. There is a episode in Our Moon Has Black Clouds where Pandita is not so excited about the celebration of Indian Independence Day. And he goes on to say that this sense of rootlessness and this sense of helplessness of not being able to visit their homes, of being ousted from their homes overnight, has led to a certain sense of discontent with the Indian nation state. So ideas of nation is variable or is rather varying, and it is sort of contingent among the populace in Kashmir. And while the Kashmiri Muslims mostly are anti-India or anti-Indian nation state, so to speak, in terms of their political aspirations, the Kashmiri Pandits have also become sort of disgruntled with the Indian nation state. So, the conflict situation and what we can sort of come to a conclusion is that while the conflict has created refugees out of Kashmiri Pandits, but they have also felt somewhat disgruntled with the Indian nation state in the process. And therefore, what we can sort of cull out rather from this situation and from the literary narratives is that the violent conflict, the armed resistance, and what we call what the Kashmiri nationalists would like to glorify, and what the Indian establishment would like to say military armed secessionist movement or militancy, has sort of created only discontent among the population. And the literature that has come out of it is sort of primarily, and this is also true about the pro Azadi narratives, because there is also a huge sense of dispossession among the pro Azadi narratives, and similar sense of dispossession and the among the Pandits also, as written in their literature. So, so to speak, what has happened in the process is what was arguably, and this is of course another discourse, that Kashmir is the paradise, and as I said, that we need to sort of get out of these discourses and under which Kashmir is shrouded. What a land which was sort of famous for its scenic beauty has sort of become the storehouse of dispossessed stories, storehouse of loss. Has become the sort of locus of loss. And I think with that I would like to conclude my lecture.
Thank you, Dr. Somjyoti Mridha. We are enlightened by your talk. And we have few questions. If you would like, take a look at the chat box. First one by Himadri Lahiri. He says that Northeast is also a conflict-ridden zone. Do you find similarities and differences in the trajectories of representation of the regions by the authors from Kashmir and the Northeast?
Well, that's a very that's a very very pertinent sort of response. Well, at the beginning, at the outset, I would like to say that, of course, I work in the Northeast, and I came here with a job, but I did not really engage with the literature of Northeast in the way that I have sort of, because Kashmir is my doctoral area. That's what my doctoral thesis is about: Kashmiri Anglophone Kashmiri literature. So somehow my acquaintance with Northeast literature is sort of very limited. But if I have read a few, of course, and from what little I have understood and read, is that there is a sense of grievance against the Indian nation state, primarily on grounds of kind of, you know, primarily on grounds of being neglected by the center, rather than that the sense of elision from the narratives of the Indianness, somehow that the Northeast is not getting its due, which is not really the case with Kashmir, because Kashmiris have always felt that they have always been given their due. They're always central to the Indian narrative, Indian history making, Indian national narratives. They regard as the crown, but it's the problem with the violence and the political ambitions are disparate. With the Northeast, it is all about lack of focus in the region. So I believe that the nature of disgruntlement, the nature of dissonance with the Indian state and the Northeast is somewhat different. And well, I mean, the kind of writings that has come up recently. Of course, I'm not acquainted with them because recently, I guess Aruni Kashyap has brought out a book on how to write about insurgency and things like that. Maybe I'll have to sort of look into it more in order to give a proper answer. But there is definitely a difference in the dynamics of how Northeast views sort of mainland India and how Kashmiris views the Indian state and mainland India, so to speak, non-Kashmiri India, so to speak. I'm not sure that clarifies it, but sort of gives a hint.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Pratim Das is asking, as you are referring here the works by Wahid, I think works of Wahid is heavily influenced by the historic events following the start of armed militancy against the Indian state. On the other, in Aga Said Ali's poetry, we sort of find complex nature of the home in post-colonial and diasporic contests, a trauma of displacement. I would like to ask you about this difference between the approach of Anglophone literature and also conveys a different perspective about Kashmir. While one is talking about resistance, but the other one is more about trauma of haunting memory and maybe a nostalgia about homeland.
Yeah. There is this thing. Okay, this is a very, very pertinent question. But one has to also look at the timeline of the publications. If you look at Aga Said Ali, the one collection that predominantly deals with the one that predominantly deals with the Kashmir conflict is The Country Without a Post Office, and that is published in 1995 at a time when the conflict was still raging. And we should also consider that Aga Shahid Ali never really lived through the conflict because he was in the US then. He used to teach there. So his experience of the conflict is via media, most probably through phone calls from family or most probably through newspapers. He did not live through the conflict. That's why there is this sense of nostalgia for the home. Because remember, the home is not lost per se. Like, for instance, like the Pandits, like Rahul Pandita and Gibu, who have lost their home. Their homes are burnt and etc. in mob violence and etc. etc. But for him, the home is lost because the home is no more like the home it used to be, and that's why there is this sense of nostalgia. On the contrary, for Mirza Wahid, who was very young during the days of the conflict, he has lived through the conflict. He's sort of experienced it firsthand, and then he migrated to the the UK. So his writings is more of a direct nature, talking about political events, talking about what was happening in terms of violence, in terms of the victimization of the Pandits, in terms of how the military has totally taken over Srinagar and its streets. But for Aga Shahid Ali, since he has no direct experience of the conflict, for him it is the sense of nostalgia. Because why should there be a nostalgia? Because the home that he knew is lost, because it has been marred with violence now. And also, of course, we should remember that Wahid and Ali are working on two different genres. While Ali is writing poems, which is of a very different nature, and in the way of articulating, in a poetic medium is different from that of articulating in a prose medium. I hope that answers his query.
Thank you. We don't have any other questions. We thank you for today taking your time and sharing your wonderful knowledge with us. and we are thankful that we got to know about the Kashmir's so much. What you said about the loss and the defense in the Pandits and the narrative of the Pandits, and also the militancy on the Muslims. Thank you for everything. Over to Protimda.
Arif, if you have anything to ask, you can ask, sir. I mean, since you are talking, I mean, working also in Kashmir, so maybe that would probably help you.
Yeah, actually, I am writing my MPhil dissertation, which is also based in Kashmir, and the representation of militancy and resistance through Bollywood films. Generally, I am starting from Roja, and then like coming till Shikara, which came out this year only. So I'm like making a historiography of the entire story of representation, how it goes through. So if you would like to suggest me any literary strategies on like developing a perspective on something new, I would be very grateful.
Okay, okay. So I wouldn't like to sort of do self promotion, but I have written an article on the cinematic narratives of Kashmir. Okay, taking into account the movies that came up in the 1960s. This Kashmir Ki Kali and Arzu and those movies. They're lovely to watch, but also embedded within it are the narratives of the Indian nation state. That they're all Hindu characters. So somehow the Kashmiri Muslim is totally erased. And I mean, that this erasure is so evident. And they're talking about Shankaracharya temple. I mean, all the movies are invariably talking about Shankaracharya temple, and none of them are referring to the number of mosques that is interspersed within many localities of Srinagar. So there's complete Hinduization, takeover of the Kashmir Valley. And then of course the backlash comes later on in the form of violence that we, of course, find very, very excruciating in the 1990s. But since you are doing beginning from Rosa, so what you can do is take a look at these earlier movies, which most probably was not part of your agenda, and you will see the stark contrast from this delectable, idyllic Kashmir full of happy romantic liaisons happening between the Full Valley and the metro-based industrialist, the Kashmir Ki Kali. This Shami Kapoor almost storms into Kashmir with agendas of love and longing, and etc. etc. And Kashmir providing solace to that, to what happens in Roja and your Mission Kashmir and Lamha and all these are there. People are coming here to sort of keep things under control, that kind of thing. Even in Rosa, this engineer is coming to sort of, do mend something which has been destroyed by the terrorists and things like that. And then they get enmeshed in the whole conflict situation. So there is some kind of difference in the narrative. And contrary to the 1960s movies, which are full of Hindu characters and everybody talking about the Shankaracharya temple, if you look at the movie after movie after movie, they show starkly Islamic symbols. The Shahai Hamdan, the Hazrat Bal Mosque, very much in Mission Kashmir. And it seems that the Kashmiri is now back. The Kashmiri is now back within the narrative, but to be controlled by the agents of the Indian state, because all are soldiers. If you see, everybody is an agent. If you see Lamha and all, they're all about soldiers and how of course the agents of the Indian state, etc., etc. Now, if you want a suggestion for books, then there is this book by Minakshi Bharat and Nirmal Kumar. They edited a volume. I'm sorry I can't give you the title. I forgot the title. Okay, wait. I'll just take a look. The title, but you can search the name Nirmal Kumar and Minakshi Bharat. They have a book on the cinematic, the cinemas of something something. Wait, let me sort of find it. Then I think Territory of Desire by Ananya Jahanara Kabir is a book that will give you some ideas because it talks about all this. I'm sure you have encountered that one. Then Minakshi Bharat also has a book called Terrorism in Indian English Novels, but it also talks about similar things. Yeah, the book is Filming the Line of Control, the Indo-Pak relationship through the cinematic lens. Filming the line of control, the Indo-Pak relationship through the cinematic lens. Edited by Minakshi Bharat and Nirmal Kumar. And if you look at it, there must be lots and lots of articles coming up. And Roja, I'm telling you, Roja is full of scholars. I mean, at least five, six very prominent scholars have written on Roja. You must be knowing already. Lots of people have written on Roja. And I have an article also talking about interrogating the idea of India and something, cinematic narratives from Kashmir or about Kashmir, something like that. You can take a look at that also. And the biblio of that will also help you, of the article. Yeah, I hope that's sort of helpful. Mike.
Yeah. Thank you. The books you mentioned, I have gone through one of them, and it was very helpful in getting a perspective about the change in representation and the change in the how you mentioned the characterization also. So it's also like after the 90s, there is a huge thing about the clothing. The Muslims are framed in Muslim attire, and the other characters are the non-Muslims. They are in like what can I say? A common dress up, like a pant and shirt.
Modern
Yeah,
modern clothing, wearing
yeah,
Western dresses, thereby signifying that Indian state is a symbol of modernity, which
exactly.
the anti-modern Muslim as Kashmiri is sort of resisting. So then it becomes a narrative of clash of modernities, or modernity tradition versus modernity. So it's interesting things can be done. You can take a look at my article also. I've spoken about all this a bit at least.
Okay, surely I will do that. We thank you for coming here today, and we would like to conclude this session. And for the next update of our next lecture, you can see through the WhatsApp on the Facebook. We will post an article about that. And thank you. We will conclude now.
Okay, thank you very much. And I thank
Thank you,
Calcutta
sir. Thank you.
Comparatists 1919 for the opportunity, and also ProTeam. I've been refusing people about online lectures, so many. At this 10 to 12, I've refused, but somehow ProTeam was too nice and too gentle. All his kind words, I said, okay, fine, I cannot say no to this guy. It will be really bad. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you so
Thank you.
much,
Thank
sir.
you
Thank
very
you
much.
so much.
Okay. So, Kinshuk, you can end the live session.
Yes, I'm ending the session.